beauty of technology. It doesn't always work exactly like we want.
Say that again. Say that again. It should be it should be working now. She's
Can y'all hear us now?
sounds on. So
okay, so it looks like maybe our sound is back on again.
So let's start over. We're going to go through the first couple of slides relatively quickly. If you're not getting sound, we are recording this, and so you'll be able to come back and watch it at a later point in time. What we're going to do now to keep moving forward is we're going to rehash the first couple of slides, and then come back to the compliance and laws and regulations slides and begin from there. So the purpose of today's session is just to provide you an overview of accessibility and usability and online learning, digital learning, whatever you want to call it. So we want to provide you with the state and federal regulations, laws, the university policies, and we want to inform you how to locate and develop electronic content, how to make it accessible and usable, and then how to, what's the difference between usability and accessibility, as they're often talked about in the same capacity. So what we have here, so what is accessibility or web accessibility? So to us, it's providing equitable access to content with consideration to the needs of people with disabilities. So this is making anything you put in electronic format accessible to those who may have different types of impairments, such as the text can be read, it's in organized logical format, and it's if I have a visual impairment, can I hear it? Usability is how user-friendly is this content I created, and it just doesn't impact those users with accessibility, but it impacts a diverse set of our learners who have varying characteristics through making it easy and efficient. And so Kristina is going to pick back up with the laws and regulations and policies.
So as I was saying, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 and the Amendments Act of that particular one in 2008 deals with accessibility for all. And this is more of a civil rights act to ensure that all individuals with a disability have access to everything. This includes web content, but it also includes things like building and events and just the like. Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 is actually more of an educational act to ensure individuals can receive a free and equal education. So we want to make sure that they have access to all of their educational materials. So this one really controls a lot of what we do here on campus for students with disabilities, and not just web accessibility, but across the board. And there are specific regulations within Section 508, and those are actually outlined in the Texas Administrative Code, what we call TAC 206. These tell specifically what we need to do, such as having alt tags for things, making sure that we have captioning, and various things like that. We also have Section 255 of the Telecommunications Act of 1996, and then we also have university policies. We have the web policy, and we have the electronic information resources accessibility policy. So basically what all of these laws, regulations, and policies say is we just need to make sure that everything is accessible to all users to ensure that they have full access. So the purpose, as I said, we want to eliminate barriers. From the picture you can see, we have a great accessible parking space. However, there's a pole right in the middle. And when we have things that prevent people from accessing information, it basically is the same thing. We put content on the website and maybe we put a video up, but we don't caption. Well, guess what? It's no longer accessible. They can see it, but you can't hear it. Or we make sure that there's, other images up, but there's no alt text. So if you don't have your vision, you're not going to be able to see the image. And if we don't tell them what that image is, then it's not going to make sense. And if that image is for content, that's going to be, kind of important. So we just want to make sure that we provide a comparable access to all users. So some of the barriers for learners with disabilities are multimedia without text equivalent. So having a video without captions, ambiguous links, things that say click here or more. If you have a bunch of those on a page to someone who's using a screen navigation software or a screen reader, all they're going to hear is more and click here. They're not going to have any idea of what that goes to. Inaccessible document formats. These would be things like scanned images of PDF files. There's actually no text on that page. There's only image, and so it's not accessible. Poor contrast, not using the right colors, relying on color for contrast. If you have things that are in red or green, but you're colorblind with red and green, you're not going to understand what those mean. So you have to use another layout that helps explain that and not just rely on color for content. And then individuals with motor skills. If you can't tab through the content on your page, then that page is no longer accessible to individuals. So we're going to talk about, or Bryan's going to talk about some do's and don'ts of accessibility, as well as just kind of give you some examples. So I'll turn that over to him now.
So Kristina did an excellent job of explaining some of those barriers for learners with disabilities. And what we're going to go through these do's and don'ts is how to break down those barriers and accommodate those barriers. So we talked about one barrier being multimedia without text equivalent. So that's providing a video or audio clip without providing text along with that, and text as either a transcript or having a caption. So we need to make sure that any type of content that we create, it has a text equivalent. So when we talk about non-text elements, again, we're talking about images, videos, and audio. So anytime any of that's provided, you have to provide some type of equivalent that makes it easy for any type of learner to access it in multiple formats. So when we talk about that video, if I can't see what's on the screen, or if I can't hear what's being played, I need to be able to read it. So we need to make documents organized and readable. And when we talk about having them organized and readable, we need to make use of the tools that are available to us. If you're familiar with Word documents or text editors through WordPress or the text editor in Canvas, there's certain tools in there that makes documents organized and readable. We talk about including header levels and things of that nature. When we format our tables, we need to make sure that we're using our tables purposefully. So we have row and column headers so that it's easy for the users to go through the tables if they're using some type of assistive technology. We're providing time flexible content. So when we talk about teaching and learning and using a learning management system, do users have enough time to be able to go through the content and complete the activities that you require? And we have to think about, if we have a learner with a disability, are they going to be able to complete it in the time that you've given to them? And then we also talk about creating content that is navigable by different modes. So essentially, when we navigate with a computer or we move through a computer, we use our keyboard and mouse. Well, for some users, they may not have the ability to use a mouse, so they need to use the keyboard to navigate through everything. And is your content navigable through the keyboard? So some don'ts. We don't want to make, when we talk about alt tagging an image, we're talking about providing text to that image using using the tools that are available through the text editors and things like that. So we need to make them concise. So don't make them too lengthy. Don't make them vague or misleading or inaccurate or redundant. So with all these do's and don'ts, we're going to be going into specific details in subsequent slides. So don't use color, as Kristina mentioned before, to convey important information, such as the green text at the bottom of the page, or go to the blue text here, or if I were to say, look at the don't column that's highlighted by red, that's not going to be helpful for those who are colorblind. Don't use tables for content layout. There's other tools that we can use to lay out content in our text editors or in Word documents. And then don't use flashing content. We need to be sensitive to those users who may be sensitive to bright colors or content that flashes that may cause difficulties for them, such as seizures. So we're going to go through some effective practices for some of these non-text equivalents. So let's first go with images. So we want to make sure when we load an image and make it available to our learners that we use the alt attribute or feature within the tools that we're using. So we need to succinctly describe the content or function of this image. And so if this image doesn't have any function or content and it's just there's a decorative image, we need to make sure we keep the alt tag blank. That way, a learner who's using technology to help them get through the content knows to skip over this and that it has no relevancy to their learning. So we need to also avoid redundancy from context. So for example, if I have an image and using the one below, and I'm describing this image, when I'm using the alt text, I don't need to provide a full description of what's exactly on there. Maybe I just want to describe this is the graph that we were referencing. And so you'll see an example of, the bad example is using an image of graph showing online enrollments, where the good example is bar chart showing online enrollment as a percentage of total enrollment from fall 2002 to fall 2011. Essentially, we're describing what type of graph it is, and then we're just laying out the title of that graph and what it represents. And you may, before that image show up, will want to describe at length what exactly this graph represents, and then you can point to that graph through that text so that users know what you're conveying or what you're relating that information to. When we talk about audiovisual media, we're talking about anything that has visual content in motion or animation, and then any auditory along with that. So being able to hear it. So when we have any type of audiovisual, especially auditory, we need to make sure that we have closed captioned text. So think about the closed captioning systems on your televisions. We need to synchronize those so that when the person's saying something, at the same time that text is being displayed on the screen as well. It's also helpful, very helpful, and highly recommended that a transcript is provided so that it could be downloaded and retrieved further for those learners who may just want to read it and not listen to the video. That's another example of providing different modalities for learners to consume their content. Providing these functions in your video will allow them to do that. And then we need to make sure, and then most audiovisual technologies have play and pause buttons. We want to make sure that they can play, pause, and go back and listen again, and so they can relive that experience. So tables, so here you can see just two examples of how to use tables and then how not to use tables. So when we have tables to organize, we mostly should use tables to organize our data. So we need to describe that we have headers, because if I'm using a technology to go through these tables, it's going to be describing each of these headers in there in a linear format and going through each of those cells underneath there. So we need to make sure that it's descriptive, what's exactly in this column, and then throughout that table. And so when we use tables for layout, it's not a good practice to use tables for layout when we're displaying web content. So we always suggest trying to find different ways are using different tools, whether it's through knowing how to create a document in HTML or using the tools in a Word document to make sure that we have things displayed side by side that aren't in a table format. So when we mentioned Word documents before, but we're also applies to web pages, or maybe you're creating a content page or an assignment page in a learning management system. The one that we use here is Canvas. We need to make sure that there's a logical format, there's a layout to this content that makes it easy for learners, especially those with disabilities, to jump through the content so they can easily identify what they are looking for, what's the purpose of this content, and it gives them the ability when they go back later to just jump through and get there, especially when you have a lot of text on a single page. So when we talk about layout, we talk about the logical heading structure. And so if you look on the right, you'll see that we have a sample heading or sample document layout where we have the page title, a section title, and then the actual meat of that content where you would add the text. So think of research papers where we have our when we have our different sections for the introduction and literature review and the methodology, it's recommended to use the heading sections in those documents, the features in the Word document, to make sure that the content is easy to jump around and get to. So if I'm a user who just wants to learn the methodology, then I could use that technology to skip to that specific part without having to read through everything else or find where that is. We need to consider the reading order. Does it make sense to have an image placed before the text without any context of that image? Or does it make sense to have instructions before students are given background information to a particular assignment? We need to think about visual order. Talking about those images again, does it make sense to have the image to the left or to the right? So we need to consider placement as well. What makes most sense for students or learners to be successful based on the order that we're structuring everything. And then consider format. We have users use multiple devices who have varying screen sizes and resolutions. So we need to consider, if we have long line lengths, do we need to break that up and make sure that we make it a little bit more condensed on the screen to where it's easier for the users to read across. Typical recommendation is probably about 20 characters across the page, 20 to 50. Font size and format style, as you can see on the right, those are different font sizes. It's not just enough to create a larger font size when we're making the document readable and accessible. We need to make use of those header functions, and then consider where we need to increase the font sizes. If you want to emphasize text, it's always recommended to use the bold feature. And then we talked about contrast before. Again, color on top of color text on top of other color. It wouldn't make sense for me to use a dark blue on top of a black background, or a light gray on top of a white background. And the example of poor contrast is what you're seeing to the right with that page title. I wouldn't recommend using that contrast on the white. I would say that a darker color would be more appropriate, such as the section title for heading 2. So links, oftentimes you'll see on the internet, links say click here or more, click for details, or click on this document. As you can see in the lower left of the slide, those are things we want to avoid using. We want to make links recognizable and descriptive. So instead of creating content so we have an example right here where it says, instead of what we have here, instead of saying something like creating content for web accessibility can often be confusing, click here to learn more. Instead of saying click here, we want to instead identify what that document is or what that web page is. So instead, we'll say creating content for web accessibility can often be confusing, but you can learn more by reading the Web Accessibility Content Guidelines overview. If you are someone who's using an assistive technology to identify what this information is, it's not going to tell you what that document is. It's just going to say click here to learn more. If I'm someone who's skipping around looking for this link, I'm not going to know what this link goes to. So when we create descriptive links, where we're basically, if you have a title to that page, if you have a title to that document, use those titles as the links to those documents when you're describing that information. Provide some context around what that link does to your learners as well. Why are they accessing this link? That also helps identify what they're going to as well. If you're linking to something outside of the learning platform that you're using, you need to tell your learners that they are accessing content outside of the learning management system so that they are aware they're leaving the platform, especially those with accessibility, because you need to make sure that any outside resource you're using is also accessible as well. So it's not just enough to create the content that's accessible for you, but if you're looking for content as well, you need to make sure that that content is accessible in itself. So there are some assistive technologies that learners with disabilities use. They range from screen readers, text enlargement software, voice dictation, and your operating systems actually have some accessibility assistive technology features built in. The most common screen reader is JAWS by Freedom Scientific. If you're curious how these work, it's free to use for a trial period, just so you can see how the students experience it, students with disabilities experience consuming content. You'll see that oftentimes it can be a very challenging event for them. Voice dictation software, I mean, you may use it if you have an iPhone series of voice dictation software. You are dictating what you want that technology or that device to do. So we have some additional resources, and we'll provide these resources outside of this webinar. But we have some web content accessibility guidelines that you can use to help generate or find content. We have some examples of how web accessibility and usability work together, and then some other checklists for accommodating with Section 508 guidelines and web accessibility for designers. So types of contrasting and where they use headers and things like that, or is there a tool to check the accessibility of my content, and we'll provide those links for you as well. And I think that's it. So we'll open up to any questions right now if anyone has any. So if you can't think of any questions right now, you are always encouraged to email us. We will follow up with contact information, and you can email those questions to us. We will also, again, make this webinar available to you, and we'll post it back on the website, but we'll also send out an announcement that it's available. And so thank you for attending our session and for working with us through our technical difficulties. We will be in touch shortly.